The supreme, profound and subtle Dharma is difficult to encounter in hundreds of millions of eons. Now that I have seen, heard and received it, I vow to realize the Tathagata's true meaning. For the sake of liberating all sentient beings, let us arouse the supreme bodhicitta. Next we shall continue our teaching on Entering the Middle Way, composed by Master Chandrakirti. As we all know, this Entering the Middle Way is a very important work of prajna thought, a great treatise that elucidates the philosophy of transcendent wisdom. Regarding its author, as mentioned yesterday, he was a lineage disciple of the Bodhisattva Nagarjuna, the glorious great Bodhisattva Chandrakirti. Actually, there are many fascinating stories about the great Bodhisattva Chandrakirti. One of them took place when he was serving as an acharya at Nalanda Monastery. At that time, the armies of the Turkic tribes began to pose a threat. It was said that from a distance of about half a month's journey, the Turks had begun their advance, preparing to attack. At that moment, from the heart of the Dharma protector of Nalanda, a crow was manifested. This crow came before Master Chandrakirti and prayed to him, saying that this time he must stop those armies. Master Chandrakirti agreed, saying, "No problem, I should have a way." Furthermore, he requested those around him to create a lion made of stone. The craftsmen worked as quickly as possible to carve out a lion made of stone. By this time, it seemed the Turkic armies had reached a place about 15 yojanas away. They had come very, very close. At this point, Chandrakirti requested the Buddhist followers to perform the consecration for the stone lion, offering prayers and supplications. He also allowed the non-Buddhists to seek blessings through prayers to Maheshvara. Then he himself took up his Zen staff, a staff made of sandalwood, and began to strike the head of the stone lion. Upon the first strike, even though it was made of stone, it began to roll its eyes. Upon the second strike, its green mane began to vibrate and shake. Upon the third strike, the lion began to leap and let out a great lion's roar. Shortly thereafter, when the Turkic armies approached the vicinity of the monastery, that stone lion went into battle against them. During the battle, not a single person was harmed, yet the victory was won very smoothly. At that time, the reigning king, named Great Strength, personally witnessed the entire process. Upon seeing this, he offered great praise, saying, "By the power of the glorious venerable Chandrakirti, he drives the mighty stone lion." Though the great Turkic army retreated, they did so without death or injury. How truly rare! He used such a verse to offer his praise. At that moment, some of the monks present thought it was due to their own power of blessings, or the result of their consecration and prayers. However, when they tried to perform further blessings or prayers, the stone lion vanished into the ground. Later, the great Acharya of Nalanda said, "This was not the blessing or power of the assembly, it was manifested through the inconceivable Dharma power of Master Chandrakirti." From this account, we can see that Master Chandrakirti was actually a great Mahasiddha. Not only was he an extraordinary treatise master of the Sutrayana, but he was also a great accomplished master. He relied on various feats that are difficult for ordinary people to achieve to bring others to submission, overcoming various external attacks or hardships. Therefore, we practitioners of the middle way often pray to him, because every master, when explaining the Entering the Middle Way, includes different verses of praise at the beginning. Everyone uses these verses to pray to Master Chandrakirti. Furthermore, our book contains the sacred image of Master Chandrakirti. You can print it out yourselves. While studying the Middle Way and the Entering the Middle Way, on one hand, it can serve as an object of your prayers, and on the other hand, you can see for yourselves whether you can finally understand through this book the essence of the Buddha's prajna thought. So in the process of learning, generally, a worldly person or certain people in the world might only seek to understand the theory. But we must not only master the theory, we must further see if its meaning can merge into our own mental continua, so that we may truly awaken to the non-dual wisdom of the middle way, the significance of this non-dual wisdom. This is the goal we seek to achieve. In our previous lesson, we said that regarding the first Bhumi Bodhisattva, we can infer invisible states from many visible behaviors. In other words, it is normally very difficult to recognize a first Bhumi Bodhisattva. But if a person can give away their own body without the slightest regret, this can actually be used to infer that this person has already attained the first Bhumi. This is a form of inference. Of course, we often say that regarding such inference, the Prasangika school relies on consequential reasons for demonstration, while the Svatantrika school relies on autonomous reasons. Usually, we use the three-mode reasoning to perform such inferences. Great masters like the omniscient Gorampa of the Sakya school also say that through the aforementioned inference, the Madhyamaka Prasangika, that is, Master Chandrakirti also accepts the autonomous syllogism on the level of conventional appearance, because someone says he is a first Bhumi Bodhisattva, and why? Because he can give away his own body. Since he gives away his body, this is proven evidence of being a first Bhumi Bodhisattva. So there are such discussions in this regard. Furthermore, why is he able to give away his own body? In reality, it is because he has already realized selflessness. In the state of the first Bhumi Bodhisattva's selflessness, he does not have the same attachment to his body that we have now, the attachment held by ordinary beings, not only for a first Bhumi Bodhisattva, but even in the Vinaya Sutras, it is said that when an Arhat attains the selflessness of an Arhat, the fruition of the level of no more learning, while someone on one side offers sandalwood water as an offering of praise, and someone on the other side uses an axe to hack at his body, the Arhat can treat both with complete equanimity. In other words, those in the lesser vehicle who have attained the fruition of no more learning also possess such a state. So for one who has attained the first Bhumi, it goes without saying. And why is this the case? Because at the first Bhumi, all co-emergent grasping at a self is abandoned. According to our own school's view, co-emergent grasping at a self is abandoned at the first Bhumi. The afflictive obscurations of conceptually imputed self-grasping are only abandoned at the seventh Bhumi. In that case, upon reaching the first Bhumi, there is no self-grasping, because our suffering is closely related to self-grasping. If this view of the transitory collection Satkaya Drishti is abandoned, then the grasping at me does not exist. Furthermore, when one attains the first Bhumi, all his physical sensations are entirely blissful. Our sensations include pleasure, pain, and also sensations that are neither painful nor pleasant. So, as stated in the relevant sutras and treatises, this is why a first Bhumi Bodhisattva gives away his own body, whereas for us, let alone giving away our bodies, even if someone says a single word to us, or if our hand comes into contact with even a tiny flame, it burns terribly and is exceptionally painful. These facts primarily show that we ordinary beings have not yet fully realized the state of selflessness. So here everyone should be able to understand. We hope that one day we will no longer be like ordinary beings, so fragile and in such pain within this samsara. Therefore, one should first put effort into this area. Now we begin today's teaching on the entering the middle way, focusing primarily on the first Bhumi Bodhisattva's second topical outline, the praise of generosity. The praise of generosity is divided into the actual praise and the principle of generosity praised by the respect of all bodhisattvas. It is divided into these two parts. First, the actual praise, the praise of the generosity of those with inferior capacity, and the praise of the generosity of bodhisattvas. And finally, a conclusion after such praise. It is divided into these three parts. First, the praise of the generosity of those with inferior capacity is also divided into two parts. The reason why those with inferior capacity need generosity, and the merits of generosity. Inferior capacity here refers primarily not to great bodhisattvas, but to our ordinary worldly people, or Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, sentient beings of that nature. So what is their generosity actually like? All living beings eagerly yearn for happiness, yet for humans there is no happiness without resources. Material resources in turn come about from generosity. Knowing this, the Buddha spoke on generosity first. Everyone should understand the literal meaning here. Generally speaking, above the fourth dhyana, there are no painful sensations, otherwise everyone has a yearning for true happiness. Among the three realms, the vast majority are ordinary beings with inverted minds. Now every ordinary being is seeking happiness, whether it's an ant on the ground, an earthworm in the soil, or all the beasts and birds in the world. Many sentient beings, including animals, are seeking peace and happiness. But such peace and happiness do not come without a cause. If there are no resources, especially for us humans, if there is no wealth or money, then this happiness will not exist. Particularly for worldly people today, everyone feels that to be happy one must have money. If there is no money, one cannot be happy. This is the belief. Now, as for this money, wealth, or resources for enjoyment, where do these things come from? In reality, one must know that all the wealth we possess now is the result of giving in this life or in the past. Only then does one have this merit in this life. So nowadays, whether they are Easterners or Westerners, everyone loves money and wealth. Without money, it is indeed difficult to move even a single step. Especially in this world, one cannot even survive. It is exceptionally painful. Now, regarding this money, many of us might believe that it is obtained through our own diligence and hard work. But in reality, effort as vast as the king of mountains is not as good as a little generosity. So what we do, what we enjoy, and the happiness we possess today is actually because we once practiced generosity. Between them, there is such a close karmic connection. Happiness comes from the generosity of money, one could say. These come from the generosity of money. Therefore, the great compassionate Buddha Shakyamuni, in the relevant sutras among all the 6 paramitas, first praised the paramita of generosity. When we speak of the 6 periods and 10,000 practices, we start with generosity. The teachings on generosity, the principles of generosity, it is through generosity that one enters the others, including discipline, patience, meditative concentration, and the other paramitas. So we all should understand, on one hand, why is generosity taught first among the 6? Generosity is relatively easy. In comparison, discipline and patience become increasingly difficult as they progress, while the earlier ones are simpler. That is one sequence. Another sequence is, in this human world, people desire to enjoy happiness. To enjoy happiness, one needs wealth. And wealth requires generosity. Therefore, what must we understand here? We must understand that the enjoyments and wealth of this life, everything we possess now, even what we eat and drink, including the clothes we wear in winter, or all the food, drink, and clothing throughout the 4 seasons, all of these things actually have a connection to oneself. I once practiced generosity. This is an unchangeable karmic connection. In this life, such a fruition has manifested. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for us. For instance, I once provided student aid. At that time, there were over 200 students. I requested that each of them say thank you to me. But regarding those students, at that time, the aid was distributed to each student. Some received 4,000, some 7,000. Everyone received it. I said, on one hand, it's not that I need the fame or those 2 words, thank you, but within your own heart, you must plant a virtuous root. However, at that time, it seems like many years ago, some people were not very willing to say it. They needed the money, but they were quite unwilling to say those 2 words, thank you. Specifically, they couldn't bring themselves to say it. Such cases exist. In fact, for many of us, including all the wealth we enjoy today, we actually need to be grateful to all the sentient beings who provided the conditions for us. Their enjoyments also come by relying on merit. Now, when we enjoy things in this life, just as was said earlier, we must also maintain them through the conduct and dedication of Samantabhadra's great aspirations. This is very important. So here we should understand this is the reason why the Buddha spoke of generosity first. Next, the merits of generosity are divided into 2 aspects. One is obtaining the happiness within samsara through generosity, and the other is relying on generosity to obtain the happiness of supramundane nirvana. Even for ordinary beings or those of the lesser vehicle, generosity is very important. These 2 points are the main focus. Those with weak compassion and ruthless minds who seek their own welfare with enthusiasm, even for them the wealth they desire will come from generosity, a cause that relieves suffering. Here it speaks not of the great Bodhisattvas, that they once practiced or are now practicing generosity and have such and such merits. We aren't speaking of that. No matter what a person's status is, even if the person is not very good, lacks faith in the 3 jewels, and lacks compassion for sentient beings, even if their mind is quite coarse, stubborn, and difficult to transform, with heavy resentment and a focus solely on selfish interest, never having a mind for benefiting others. Take, for example, certain worldly merchants. They give the least to gain immense wealth. This is a general business logic, using a small amount of capital to exchange for great profit. Now, for such a person, if they have practiced generosity through various methods, then the enjoyments they seek will also be obtained in a continuous stream. Their suffering will also be extinguished in a very short amount of time. Therefore, no matter what status a person has, generosity possesses truly vast merit. For anyone within samsara, while enjoying the wonderful pleasures of the 5 senses, if they also perform even a little bit of generosity, then such merit is also inconceivable. So regarding the material enjoyments of our world, when we possess them ourselves, we should also perform some generosity. Some say that if the mind is not pure, it might be better not to give. In reality, that is not the case. It is stated here as well, even if compassion is inferior, the character is not good, and there is no altruistic intent at all. Even if one is completely controlled by a selfish mind, practicing generosity in such a state is still useful. Therefore, generally speaking, generosity is another way to allow everyone to obtain benefit. Such benefit is also advantageous for sentient beings. For instance, the Sutra of the Right Mindfulness of Dharma says, without giving one is born in heaven but enjoys little happiness there. Through giving one is born among humans and enjoys wealth and happiness from birth. The meaning is that if we do not practice generosity, even if we are reborn in the heavenly realms among the devas, although devas still have much merit, their happiness will still be very limited. Therefore, in our human life, if we practice generosity, we will have much merit. Why is it that nowadays some people do not need to work particularly hard, yet wealth and merit come to them naturally? This is the generosity of past lives. If I have not practiced generosity, even if I am reborn in the heavenly realms, I would still be a relatively poor deva. If reborn in the human world, the human world would also be very painful and very poor. If one has practiced generosity, the Sutra of the Right Mindfulness of Dharma also mentions that even as an animal, one would be very well off. Furthermore, if reborn as a hungry ghosts originally have nothing to eat or drink and are very pitiful, but if they had practiced generosity, then upon being reborn as a hungry ghost, relatively speaking, those hungry ghosts would also have some merit. So in our world, everyone should understand this generosity is indeed very important. If we have material wealth, we should perform some material generosity. If we have the ability to perform the gift of Dharma, that is also very good. Of course, in this treatise, the focus here is primarily on material generosity, because this is the paramita of generosity. When the perfection of giving is taught, it is primarily the first Bhumi Bodhisattva who is discussed regarding generosity. Now, does a first Bhumi Bodhisattva possess the other 6 paramitas? The other 6 paramitas are also present. For example, a first Bhumi Bodhisattva must practice giving, discipline, patience, and so forth. All the other paramitas must be cultivated, but here it is highlighted the merits of generosity are presented as the primary focus. So here, even if reborn within samsara, those who practice generosity will obtain happiness. In our world, we can also see that this karma is inconceivable. For instance, among those confined in prison, if they practice generosity before and have their own merit, their food and clothing will be very good. Even if you hold a high position or something similar and appear to be quite well off in some respects, if you didn't practice generosity before, you will often be short on funds and in a state of distress. Such phenomena are quite common. Therefore, performing generosity is extremely meaningful. This applies to those whose minds are generally inferior, who have bad tempers, poor character, and no faith. Even for such people, practicing generosity is still meaningful. Just now it was shown that it is not the case that only a first Bhumi Bodhisattva performs generosity. That is not so. If we ordinary beings practice generosity, there are truly vast benefits. So in the process of giving, it doesn't necessarily require a lot of money. As long as one has a mind of rejoicing in this regard, then once these conditions gradually mature, they will bring great benefits to oneself. Next, it speaks of the principle of obtaining nirvana through generosity. Indeed, it is through the practice of generosity that he will swiftly at some point meet the Aryas. He will then cut clean the continuum of cyclic existence, and as a result he will journey to the state of peace. This means that if we give for those who engage in the practice of generosity, even if it's generosity for self-benefit, ultimately they will have many opportunities for achievement. Indeed, it is through the practice of generosity here, even for Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas who lack compassion, or for certain ordinary beings when they perform generosity, actually when you give, it's not necessarily the case that you will obtain the fruition in a very short amount of time. But while you are giving, you might encounter some noble ones. In the process of giving, one might encounter those who indeed possess realization. Initially, it was giving for selfish reasons, but in the process of giving, you then encounter noble ones or practitioners who possess realization. Encountering these noble ones in a very short amount of time, this is also a natural law, encountering noble ones. In fact, I feel that for us, for example, if we set our minds on building a school or doing something, it seems that benefactors often appear. For instance, at the beginning, there might be nothing. I want to build a shrine, I want to craft a Buddha statue. In such cases, many people, perhaps at the start, they have nothing on hand, but later it seems they suddenly appear. There was once a Dharma master who was building some structures in a certain place. At the beginning, there was no money, but he made that aspiration. Later, it seemed that originally that place was quite remote regarding that construction. In many respects, many karmically connected people suddenly appeared. So this is a kind of natural law. For example, when someone makes a certain aspiration, it seems a benefactor also emerges. Or if a benefactor wants to make some offerings or do something significant, it seems karmically connected practitioners will also appear. As is said in the Sutra of the Supreme King of Mahayana, because of practicing constant giving, one is called a donor, Shishu. We often say donor, donor. What kind of donor? One who practices generosity and virtuous dharma long term. This is called a donor. With generosity as the primary focus, we call them donors. Furthermore, in the process of propagating the Buddha Dharma, just as is said in the dedication chapter of the Way of the Bodhisattva, does it not say, may the high monks and great masters live long in the world, may the donors also have their lives extended, and so forth. Therefore, the propagation of Buddhism, or its enduring presence, also requires the strenuous support of many people, including now in this Dharma-ending age, whether it be a practice center, a monastery, or the monastics, many conditions must be fulfilled. However, such conditions need not be excessively extravagant or luxurious, specifically being too extravagant. This is something that a practice center, a monastic, or the Sangha cannot pursue. If you pursue things in this area, your essential nature is already lost. But basic survival, especially in this day and age, probably requires many people. Some have ability, they rely on that ability to help propagate the Buddha Dharma. Some have ability in terms of money, some might have power or possess their own other resources. Only when all these resources are provided does the Buddha Dharma have the opportunity to remain long in the world. So here it is also mentioned, when one personally practices generosity, one will quickly encounter very extraordinary noble ones. These noble ones will provide refuge and teach the Dharma to the donor. After the Dharma is taught, the person begins to practice the true path. After practicing, they can also forever sever those obstacles within the three realms of samsara, the three existences. Gradually, they proceed toward the fruition of cessation. The cessation here refers primarily to the Arhats, or the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas. The fruition in that regard, the fruition of a noble one. Previously, it seems in the biography of Patrul Rinpoche, was it not mentioned? Sometimes he could recall many past lives. Once when a certain venerable Krishnacharya appeared, he offered a golden bracelet. Because of this reason, in life after life thereafter, he never encountered poverty. It seems Patrul Rinpoche has this in his biography. So perhaps for some who make sincere aspirations and encounter some true noble ones or the Sangha, well, I feel that for offering wealth, the Sangha is relatively more reliable. As for those other so-called noble ones, if they truly bring benefit to sentient beings, it's fine. But otherwise, I feel that making offerings to the Sangha is perhaps better. No matter what, those who practice generosity will later encounter very good conditions, and then they will practice well themselves. Finally, although living in the human world, they also sever the stream of the three existences and ultimately obtain the fruition of cessation. This describes how even general inferior generosity also possesses great merit. Next, at the second point, the praise of the generosity of bodhisattvas. Those who keep in mind their pledge to help sentient beings without much delay attain joy through their generosity. Ordinary beings might not experience the fruits of their generosity immediately, but for those bodhisattvas who vow to benefit sentient beings, the purpose of their generosity is not to get something back for themselves. They do not seek any return at all. As we all know, if a worldly person makes an investment, they calculate how much money they invest and how much return they get. That is their efficiency, that is their objective. Without such a return, investment is impossible. One wouldn't simply give to everyone for no reason. That is impossible for them. But the purpose of a bodhisattva's generosity, their initial intent, is never about what they can get for themselves. It must be that they want sentient beings to obtain benefit. Therefore, when he practices generosity, if the other party is satisfied, whether it be a beggar or someone in need of help, if that person is content in their heart, then the bodhisattva is exceptionally joyful. In our world, we often talk about this. For instance, in business, one seeks economic benefits. I invest a certain amount, and I must recoup the cost and gain a certain profit on top of that. This is economic efficiency. But regarding social efficiency, suppose I build a school. I might cultivate some talented people there, but besides that, it's impossible for me to make money. I might even have to subsidize it with a great deal of my own funds. However, this kind of benefit is advantageous to sentient beings and to people. So what is being taught here? If a bodhisattva practices generosity, he is not like a worldly person. For us worldly people, if we perform an act of giving, suppose it is to a very pitiful person, I give to him, and after a while, once he has grown up, I might wait and see if he can repay me. One is constantly waiting for this. But as for a bodhisattva, he does not seek any return at all. Why? Because his objective, his original intent, is to help others and let them obtain benefit. If the other person is joyful, your objective has already been achieved. Therefore, everyone should understand. Sometimes when we give, we should look at whether the other party has obtained benefit. If they have obtained benefit, that is what the bodhisattva wants. It is not that the bodhisattva wants the person to get well and then later, when they grow up, to repay you twofold before you feel that the act was worthwhile. Actually, it is not like that at all. Among us worldly people, for example, including what is said in some movies nowadays, someone might say, I have given my all for 8 or 10 years in this relationship, and now it has all come to nothing. I have nothing left. So many years of my life have been wasted, and they complain incessantly. But if it were a bodhisattva, while I was with that person, if they were happy and joyful, then I am content. I haven't gained anything now, but through my life I made you happy for 10 years or 5 years. That is a need. As a bodhisattva, that is what is needed. For a worldly person, this would certainly not work. If you are happy, I should be happy forever. If I am not happy, then I have lost out. I've wasted my life, and then they start to settle the score with you. So sometimes the calculations of a bodhisattva are completely different from those of an ordinary person. Furthermore, the calculations of an ordinary person must result in a victory for self-interest. As for the benefits brought to others, they don't really count those. And if the other person has also made sacrifices, they don't really count those either. So regarding the interactions in the world, whether it be mutual exchanges or mutual sacrifices, we can look at it this way. Even a merchant, regarding his own losses or the amount invested, the return he receives must be a double profit. If he hasn't made a profit, he is unhappy in his heart. But a bodhisattva is not like that. As long as the other person obtains benefit, even if you fail, even if you lose, even if you have sacrificed a great deal and haven't even recovered your costs, as long as there is even a tiny benefit for the other party, it is worth it, it is acceptable. This is the reason for praising the generosity of bodhisattvas. Next is the conclusion of the praise, the third point, the conclusion of these praises. Since it's for both the compassionate and the one who is not, this discourse on generosity is primary, because this is a summary of what we discussed earlier: generosity with compassion and generosity without compassion. Generosity with compassion refers to the bodhisattvas just mentioned, including the first Bhumi bodhisattva, who can give even his own flesh to sentient beings, that kind of generosity. Then there is generosity without compassion, the giving of ordinary people. As just mentioned, weak compassion and ruthless minds, giving that is entirely for self-interest. No matter what kind of giving it is, such generosity is exceptionally meaningful. If it is generosity without compassion, it can become the cause for the merits of gods and humans, the cause for higher rebirth, abhyudaya. If it is generosity maintained by great compassion, that is the cause for liberation. One even obtains that kind of joy. Actually, no matter the circumstances of the giving, even if you give with a mind of resentment or give for the sake of the eight worldly concerns, benefits will still be obtained. I know someone who loves to give things away. He gives to those above him and those below him, even giving to some people who might be deceptive. I sometimes ask him, "Why do you give so frequently?" He says, "No matter what, I don't investigate their background. Whenever something is given to others, they are all joyful. Even a great leader is happy to receive even a tiny gift. So I just like giving to others. Some people say you are too foolish, don't give too much, otherwise some people will just cheat you. But he says even if they cheat me, they still need it. Even if they cheat me, they are happy when I give it to them. So as long as I make them happy and joyful, I feel that is very good." So here he is also saying, when we practice generosity, indeed, if we meet any sentient being and perform some act of giving, it is very good. Of course, within generosity, one form is material giving. When we have the merit, performing some material generosity is very important. If material giving is not possible, or if one has other abilities, giving of fearlessness, such as life release, when another being is close to death and needs to be given to, rescuing it from the jaws of death, the merit of this is inconceivable. Although our current practice of giving fearlessness and life release is in many ways not like it was before, nowadays things are quite inconvenient. But in this regard, I have heard of some people who used to do collective life releases. Now that collective releases are not very convenient, they have arranged the life release tasks among dozens of people, 2 people per day. One day these two, the next day those two, and finally it's all gathered together. Those 2 people go and buy some animals to set free. For example, with 60 people, 2 by 2, their month-long life release goes unnoticed by others. In fact, when people do any virtuous deed, including hearing, contemplating, and practicing, there is always an opportunity. One should be able to think of some way. This is giving fearlessness, which is also very important. And then giving of Dharma is indeed very important. Especially in this current age, the gift of Dharma is crucial, including monastics, if they can teach the sutras and explain the Dharma. Of course, that is excellent if they have the opportunity. Even if someone is not a monastic but a lay practitioner who truly understands some Buddhist principles, even just chatting with everyone. Aren't many people nowadays, streamers or influencers, getting famous for all kinds of messy things? It would be better if we spoke some truth, spoke of truth, goodness, and beauty, and those principles related to the Buddha Dharma. If you speak them, it's the same. This time you can occupy it. Whether this time and space are occupied by Mara or by the Buddha depends on us Buddhists. In fact, teaching the Dharma shouldn't be seen as the job of just a few Khenpos, as if for their whole lives only those few were appointed, sent by God to teach the Dharma, and that we have no such responsibility. Actually, that kind of thinking is wrong. For those of us who have studied the Mahayana Dharma, everyone should, through various ways, explain what they have understood to others, to help others resolve their confusion and remove their doubts. I feel this is very important. If we do this, do the Mahayana Sutras not say frequently, if a person offers the 7 jewels to countless Buddhas throughout the 3,000-fold world system, the merit is of course vast. Of course it is very vast. Yet compared to that, if a person takes a single verse of the Mahayana and explains it to others, the merit is many times greater than the former. It is always stated this way. So even if it is just sharing one verse a day with others, that is also exceptionally meaningful. However, many people nowadays are quite strange. It seems they are not ashamed to talk about all sorts of messy and nonsensical things online. That is seen as a normal thing, but when it involves the Buddha Dharma, some are far too timid, some simply do not dare to speak. This involves the Buddha Dharma. How could I dare to speak of it? You dare to use all kinds of language involving greed, anger, and ignorance, yet regarding these matters of the Dharma, things so pure and so meaningful, why can't you discuss them? Therefore, I believe the gift of Dharma is also very important. We also hope that many people will, on one hand, engage in lifelong learning themselves, and on the other hand, when the opportunity arises, try their best to proclaim it to others. The person who transmits the Buddha Dharma is not necessarily designated such that only a Khenpo can speak. It's not as if he is an AI programmed solely for teaching, while no one else could be set to do so. It is not like that at all. So every single person has a responsibility. Every person has this kind of altruistic mind. If that is the case, since the capacities of sentient beings are varied and diverse, many people can then obtain benefit. Next, we discuss the principle of how to give with respect. This refers to the meaning of the Bodhisattva being exceptionally joyful regarding generosity. If the mere sound of please give brings such joy to a bodhisattva, a bliss unknown even to a noble one in cessation, what need to speak of giving all? Here, through an analogy, it explains that a son of the Buddha who has entered the Mahayana is exceptionally joyful when practicing generosity. What kind of joy is it? He explains here, if a son of the Buddha, one who has generated bodhicitta, hears the voice of someone seeking a gift, for example, a beggar comes to your door, knocks, or calls your name, could you give me a little something to eat, a little something to drink, a little bit of clothing? When language such as this reaches your ears, as a son of the Buddha of the Mahayana, the moment he hears this sound, a sense of joy and happiness naturally arises within his heart, because as a bodhisattva practicing the Mahayana, it is sometimes very difficult to even hear the voice of someone requesting a gift. Therefore, when he does hear such a sound, he is very, very joyful. What kind of joy is it? This joy of his is described through an analogy. It is like a noble one entering cessation. When a noble Arhat enters the meditative absorption of cessation, there is no happiness in the world that matches it. Because upon entering the absorption of cessation, all suffering is absent, and within one's own realization there is exceptional bliss. Yet even that bliss is incomparable to this. Perhaps for some people it is not like this at all. Not only are they not joyful, they even give rise to immense resentment. When someone seeks a gift, you've come again, you were here the other day and you're back today. How did you get here? After hearing it, they are particularly displeased and unhappy. Upon seeing the person, they are also quite repulsed. Such situations may occur, but for a son of the Buddha, a bodhisattva who has truly generated Mahayana bodhicitta, when he hears the voice of someone in need of generosity, at that moment, far from being repulsed, he is exceptionally joyful. This joy is such that the pleasures of our world have no way to compare to it. Therefore, if merely hearing the sound of a plea for help brings such joy, then if one uses one's own body, speech and mind to give everything and anything to others, that joy goes without saying. If just hearing someone's cry for help makes you that joyful, then if you have the chance to personally participate, personally give and personally benefit sentient beings, that joy is difficult to describe with language. Previously in the Maharatnakuta Sutra, it was also told that there was a donor whose only son, his child, had gone missing. Many years after the disappearance, the child was found. When he found him, he was very, very joyful. The Buddha said in that sutra, when a bodhisattva sees a beggar, his heart is filled with great joy. Compared to the joy of that elder, the elder's joy does not equal 1/16 of the bodhisattva's. It says that when a bodhisattva sees a beggar, a person seeking alms, the great joy in his heart is such that the joy of the elder finding his child cannot compare even to a 16th part of it. This kind of joy is very difficult to explain. So here it primarily speaks of how a bodhisattva indeed possesses a natural altruistic mind and is very, very joyful. You may have seen this before. When Shakyamuni Buddha was on the path of learning, every time he gave his head, eyes, brain or marrow, he was always joyful. Actually, from our perspective as followers, those instances during the Buddha's path of learning where a very ugly and wicked Brahmin comes to ask for his son, ask for his daughter, ask for his elephant and even ask for his wife, it seems particularly repulsive and excessive. First he wants this, then he wants that. We would likely be exceptionally annoyed. But for a bodhisattva, giving all that he has to sentient beings is a form of joy. So in our current society, many values are certainly not the same. But being different is also normal because we are ordinary beings. However, this state of a bodhisattva is something we might not be able to accept all at once. We feel we must engage in self-improvement and self-protection. Why be like that? Of course, for now, you can keep your attitude as it is. But in reality, such a selfish mind actually causes us to enter further into suffering, unable to extricate ourselves. It does not necessarily bring great benefit. Next, it speaks of performing generosity after such respect. Here, if one is very respectful toward generosity, one can perform acts of giving. Of course, regarding this performance of giving, it refers to those who have not necessarily attained the bhumis. For those who have not attained the bhumis, when they give, their generosity is such that they can endure it. He uses the giving of one's own body as an analogy.
Liebjeder terejang dakkar dungor ki jandag nam ki nyara laso per dungor rang nitam thonen tepchid shapshir nirtam sonri stom.
Cutting his body and giving it away, he sees from his own pain the pain of others, such as their birth in the hells, as if he were undergoing these situations himself. Thus swiftly he strives to cut away all their pain. There are some discussions on this in the debating courtyards, but today we will explain it literally. The meaning is that for those who have not attained a higher state, including bodhisattvas of the Mahayana mind, dwelling on the path of accumulation or the path of preparation, these bodhisattvas who have generated the Mahayana resolve, they also possess an exceptionally strong compassion. They will also cut their own flesh, just like Dharmarakshita mentioned earlier. Though an ordinary being, they cut their own flesh, including many donations in society today, cutting one's own. For example, donating a kidney or a liver, donating many organs of the body or the eyes. Such things exist. Some are done after death, some while still living. Now, for these people, their altruistic mind is actually very strong. He cuts the flesh of his own body and gives it to other sentient beings. When giving to other sentient beings, if he is a practitioner of the Mahayana resolve, how does he give it? He actually observes the suffering of the hells. Today I cut my own organs to give to sentient beings. While giving to others, the physical pain of cutting is excruciating. If it is exceptionally painful, how will he visualize? Wow, if the flesh of my own body is cut like this, it is extremely painful. But now, besides me, there are countless sentient beings in the hells currently suffering. They are suffering in the hungry ghost realm, and among the animals, they are also being slaughtered and cut. Sometimes when watching short videos, one sees nowadays the killing of pigs and chickens is often quite terrifying. I sometimes still feel that if there were methods for painless killing or taking of life, it might be slightly better, because many people now follow certain electric shock methods used in German and Japanese slaughterhouses. Perhaps this is a bit better. Otherwise, the traditional way of using a knife to cut one's body is very terrifying. Nowadays, some people do it intentionally for play. Some might do it on purpose. For example, 2 or 3 people tie a person up, press them onto a wooden block like a pig being slaughtered. One person pretends to cut his throat, and some red liquid starts to flow nearby. The person begins to scream loudly, "Arg!" Actually, on one hand, this is a human mimicking someone else, but if a person were truly treated like a slaughtered pig, did these methods of cutting the body not exist in ancient times? If your throat were cut like that, what would that feeling be like? Everyone should be able to infer it. Therefore, for one who has generated the bodhicitta, they are able to give away their own body. At the same time as they are giving their body, they visualize the suffering in the hells, what it is like. Since other sentient beings are in such pain, then my cutting away a little flesh is nothing. He feels that his own suffering is extremely slight. Sometimes we undergo surgery ourselves. At that time we can think to ourselves, I hope that through this cutting of my flesh, of course nowadays there's no need to endure it. I have personally had many surgeries, and they all involve anesthesia. At those times one is simply unaware, but at the very beginning one should make an aspiration, thinking, today I shall perform the generosity of the body. One can recite some verses. For instance, a while ago when they were giving me acupuncture, the needles were pricked into my body like grass growing. So many silver needles, a whole large pack of them, and then prick, prick, prick. At first I visualized the suffering of sentient beings, but as soon as the needles went in, I forgot the pain came immediately. However, we should try our best to observe our physical pain. Although we cannot cut our own flesh to give to others, we can take on suffering to represent theirs. To sever all the suffering within the 3 realms of samsara, one should also diligently dedicate the merit and practice. The way of the Bodhisattva also says, if one feels compassion for the suffering of others, how could one's own suffering increase? If one is constantly thinking of the suffering of others, it seems that one's own pain no longer counts as pain. This is a very good method for alleviating suffering. If we truly do not hold on to our own suffering with such intense attachment, and instead show great concern for the suffering of others, this becomes a powerful and steadfast motivation. Thinking this way can stimulate the potential for great compassion within our mental continua. Great compassion is naturally drawn out. In this way, through our own physical pain, we can understand the suffering of others. Conversely, when we observe the suffering of others, it seems our own pain is actually lessened. In fact, every time we encounter these various sufferings in our lives, the moment we think of this, this is nothing, there are others suffering much more. Because many people nowadays compare themselves upwards, I should stop comparing upwards and start comparing downwards. For instance, among my classmates, many who are above me are my idols. While I might not catch up to those above, I am not as good as those above, but better than those below. At that moment, one's own suffering suddenly begins to diminish. Therefore, if one observes the suffering of others, one's own pain should indeed decrease. So in the past, Bodhisattva Nagarjuna also gave up his body. What was said, the meaning is that for a bodhisattva there is no physical pain and no mental pain. Why? Because once the bhumas are attained, both physical and mental pain are gone. But even if we haven't attained the bhumas, through making an aspiration, arousing compassion, and practicing the exchanging of self and others, our own suffering will be reduced. One reduces pain through compassion, or reduces pain through the practice of emptiness. Generally speaking, within this human world at present, many sentient beings are in great pain. Practicing according to the Mahayana methods can lessen the suffering of others and also lessen one's own suffering. Putting effort into this area is exceptionally meaningful. Therefore, through the study of the entering the middle way, our hearts become stronger and stronger. When we encounter pain, we will all think this doesn't count as suffering. There are sentient beings suffering even more. I must find a way to pull others out of their pain. At that moment, it becomes exceptionally meaningful for your entire life. All right, that is all for today's teaching.
Bandara